Hello everybody, my name is Dratnos and welcome to This Week in Mythic Plus. This week's affixes are Sanguine, Quaking, Fortified, and the Awaken pattern is still on the B pattern, which is the same one that we had active last week. This is a pretty great week for pushing keys, assuming you can play around that Sanguine mechanic. So ever since Quaking was nerfed to not deal any damage unless you actually stack on top of somebody, it's become one of the more favorable affixes to have in that level 7 slot. And Sanguine is annoying, it's challenging, in some dungeons in particular it can be very difficult to deal with effectively, but the thing about it is that if you do deal with Sanguine effectively, it doesn't cost you any time from your dungeon. Whereas many of the other affixes, no matter what you do, you're going to have to change your strategy in a way that causes you to lose time. So this is a really good week for those top-level teams that are going to be looking to push, 25s, 26s, but it's also a good week to get your 15s done. Good week to, farm those medium-level keys, lower-level keys even. Again, the Sanguine mechanic really the only one that you have to worry about for the most part. Almost all the others pretty favorable this week. Great week to get into any kind of keystone. Let's get into each dungeon and talk about how they all work. All right, so we start with Atal'Dazar, as always. If you want to find my routes, you can find them on Raider.io, and in the description below, I'll have a link to them as well. So Atal'Dazar on the B pattern of Awakened is the harder of the two Awakened patterns still, and that's bad news for this dungeon this week. That means that this spire over here is the one that has the spider behind it, rather than the blob. And the spider is an enemy that most groups aren't comfortable fighting with Yasma, because there's kicks already on Yasma, and the spider doesn't move nicely in a way that you'd want an enemy to move when you're fighting Yasma because of all the other spiders on that fight. So for the most part, most groups are not comfortable fighting this with Yasma. That means that we have to find a way to activate this spire. We're not going to fight the double honor guard pack because that's crazy. So instead, you're going to have to do something like running out here, grabbing these, and then running to the side, having the rest of your group activate the spire, and then having that person vanish or whatever. That kind of strategy is something you can do this week, but it's still a pretty annoying dungeon because you're probably going to want to activate all 4 of these obelisks. You could skip the blob here, but the blob is one of the better positioned obelisks. And you could skip the fear guy, but then you have a hard time getting to Volkal, and the fear guy is also one of the harder obelisks to do with Yasma. So all in all, Atal'Dazar, particularly on the B pattern of Awakened, is awkward in terms of just making it so you can get to all of those portals and activate them is slow. If you're an expert level group, if you're able to fight 1 or 2 Awakened enemies with Yasma, this dungeon is not as bad, and you can design a route that's a little bit less awkward in going to activate all these obelisks. But this is my take at, I think, the way that you're going to lose the least time going to activate all of these different obelisks. It does fight the middle pack here, which is something that a lot of groups don't ever pull, but I think it's pretty good count. Even on Fortified, I think it's not bad to pull this thing. Just, it does do quite a bit of damage, so be careful of that. So Freehold with Sanguine, something that would normally be a problem is the Cutwater Harpooners. That's something that can cause real problems with Sanguine, actually. But luckily, we can make all those friendly this week by joining the crew. So you got to do the dog event this week to join the crew, but once you do that, you can get the Cutwater Harpooners on your side, and then you're not actually going to have to deal with them in any of the pulls in this area. So that's a nice thing that makes Sanguine a little bit less bad this week. A couple things to note. When you're doing that dog event, one thing that you can do if you don't have somebody who can stealth and do it is you can do it after you've done the spire here, and you can have 4 people in the group stay in the Awakened realm while one person goes out and does the dog event and dies, and then the people, you can actually res them from within the Awakened realm. They will show up in the real world, not in the Awakened realm, but you can do this to avoid having anybody accidentally get in combat while one person, death runs and does the dog event. That's something that can save you a little bit of time here. Other than that, pretty good dungeon this week for these affixes, and I think one that you're gonna... a lot of top Freehold keys are gonna be done this week. King's Rest, we've got a couple of... so any on-death affix week, like Sanguine week, you always gotta watch out for these minions Azul, as they will trigger those affixes. So you're gonna have a bunch of Sanguine pools when you fight these things, and when these things come in. That can be something that can become problematic if you're not careful about when these come in, but it's not as bad as something like bolstering or bursting can be. So it's probably the best of those on-death affixes to have active in this dungeon. Other than that, not too much going on in here beyond normal. Fortified Shadow of Zul, something that, depending on your tank healer comp, that might be the hardest part of the dungeon for you, so you may want to save Bloodlust for that. But it's usually more efficient if you can to lust, the last boss, and then that sometimes gives you another lust near the start of the bridge or something. So that's something that I'd recommend doing this week. Shrine of the Storm, most of the little enemies in here don't trigger Sanguine. The ones that do are the Tide Sage Initiates, so you fight them here, here, and here. That's where you're gonna have to deal with Sanguine, but none of the other little enemies do it. Like, these things don't trigger Sanguine. The eels at the end don't trigger Sanguine. The droplets don't trigger Sanguine. So that's a pretty nice quality of life thing here. Would be a much nicer quality of life thing if these things didn't drop Sanguine, but whatever. Other than that, nothing too big here. You can't... So, with Sanguine, sometimes this area can be a little bit bad. You may want to skip this area. The problem with skipping this area is you're going to need, like, all of this instead. I think this is still slower, but it might be easier than this area. So you can make that adjustment if you want, particularly if you don't like handling these Tide's Edge Initiates and getting a bunch of Sanguine in these narrow corridors. Siege of Boralus with Sanguine active is a big challenge, especially Horde side, because we got a couple extra little enemies that drop Sanguine here. It's a little bit counter to the whole strategy that you might be using of having Ashvane spotters kill everything. My routes don't really rely on that strategy in a super aggressive way, but one of the best ways to do this dungeon is to use an Ashvane spotter to kill almost everything in here. If you're going to do that, you have to be really careful of Sanguine, because you can defeat the whole purpose if you end up Sanguine healing, most of the mobs back up to full from the first one dying. So a lot of discipline there. Abilities like displacement effects, Typhoon, Ring of Peace, all of those kinds of things, Thunderstorm. Those can be really good ways to get enemies out of Sanguine puddles. You just gotta be careful with when you use those kind of knock effects, because if you use them too early, then you're not gonna have them when you actually need them towards the end of the pull. So that's, yeah, Siege of Boralus, really all about Sanguine this week. None of the other affixes too impactful in here. It's a great Temple of Sethraliss week. This is one of the kinder dungeons for Sanguine and Quaking. Not really a bunch of areas that Sanguine's gonna cause you a huge problem. You do have to watch out for the boss fights still, especially depending on how your healer's feeling. The Quaking lockout can still be an issue. On fights like Galv, for instance. And do make sure also in this last area, you got to be careful with where you kill these Hexers, because you can kill them where the boss fight Hexers are going to spawn, and then they'll be spawned in a pool of Sanguine. You won't be able to kill them for like a minute. So dragging these Hexers to the edges of the room or to the middle of the room before killing them is a good way to avoid the potential of that happening. Motherlode is a tough Sanguine dungeon, especially the more that you try and kill in this starting area. So there are some routes, for instance, that'll be killing much more trash in the starting area of this dungeon, and there are some routes that'll skip it entirely on Sanguine weeks. I've opted for a little bit of a middle ground here, but the main problem with Sanguine is these Peacekeepers will do these cast sequences for like 10 seconds, and they're immune to CC, and if there's a Sanguine puddle underneath them, they're healing to full when they're doing that, and that's going to cost you a lot of time if that happens to you. So the way you want to play this is if you do have knock effects, you want to try and knock low health enemies right before they die away from underneath Peacekeepers. To stop the potential of that happening. Mostly it's just going to be on your tank, though. Your tank just has to be aware of Sanguine and continually position mobs as they're about to die so that there's no potential that Peacekeepers can get healed to full. Pretty much no matter what you do, some of that is going to happen, but you want to minimize how often it happens to save as much time as possible. Pretty great week here for the Underrot as well. None of these affixes too big in here. I mean, of course, Sanguine always something to watch out for, but it's a pretty wide open dungeon. There's not really any narrow spaces that Sanguine's going to be a huge issue in, so you're mostly just playing against the dungeon. You are fighting an awakened enemy with the last boss here using my route, but it's just the Blood of the Corruptor, so nothing too scary. The Blood of the Corruptor on the last boss in this dungeon kind of doesn't do very much, because the areas that it pollutes are the areas that the boss pollutes anyways, so you're kind of already playing around the Blood of the Corruptor by just doing the boss mechanics. So I think this is one of the easier awakened enemies to fight with that boss. And I would absolutely recommend not getting count in this area because it's so slow and inefficient. Tol Dagor is probably one of the worst dungeons for this week. Sanguine in here is an extremely technical affix. So aside from this first area, once you actually get inside of the prison, Sanguine is going to be a huge problem for you if you're not playing around it well. That's because the spaces are narrow, enemies have lots of different health totals, and there are lots of little neutral enemies that'll drop Sanguine. And a lot of these enemies flee when they're low on health as well, which means you're going to have a hard time controlling where they drop Sanguine because they just do whatever they want when they're low. They run in random directions. So for that reason, this is a really tough dungeon to get well executed this week. On top of that, the cannon area, if you're trying to cannon a bunch of stuff and then you drop a Sanguine puddle, that's going to heal up everything else that you're trying to cannon. Then you're going to run out of cannon shots, and there will be a lot of enemies that are pretty dangerous there. To play around this, I generally advise just doing 1 or 2 packs with cannons this week. Don't do anything too ambitious unless you're really confident. And yeah, it's still going to be it's still a tricky dungeon this week, but it is by no means impossible. And it's fortified and Quaking are the other affixes, so much of the rest of it can be minimal difficulty, right? It's just if you can play around that Sanguine or not. Sanguine in Waycrest Manor, it can be difficult in some spots, but it's pretty much always manageable. So there are the tight hallways and corridors, but you can basically always pull enemies back to the most recently cleared open space. So the way that I do this usually is, I'll get to the courtyard and then I'll pull whatever trash is next back out into the courtyard and try and have it die, way back out in the space that I'm not going to need. And then I can pull the next trash pack back out to the courtyard, and again, I'll have a bunch of open space for it. That works better than trying to fight enemies in the actual corridor areas themselves, because then you'll get a lot of blood, on the ground here, and you or enemies will need to cross over that to do the next pull, and that's going to cause damage from Sanguine. So that's the main way to play around this affix this week. Junkyard not too bad with Sanguine active. Again, you're going to want to focus on getting your bots as early as possible, because bots are really strong in Junkyard. They scale. The shock bot damage scales with keystone level, so the higher level key you're doing, they will continue to scale up in terms of how much of your damage they're doing, and it makes the dungeon basically not get as hard per extra keystone level as the other dungeons, unless you wipe, and then you lose your bots and things go really wrong. I think that in North America, you're going to be able to go to Gunker first. I think this route's going to work in North America this week. Next week, I think the hard mode enemy is going to be over Gunker, so that's going to change your strategy. And I think in Europe, I don't know which weeks Europe has the hard mode enemy over Gunker, but I think it's a different set than America does. So if you're in Europe, you may not be able to actually go Gunker first. Even if the hard mode enemy is over Gunker, I would advise going left at the start just to pick up all of these shock bots that are really easy to get on this side. But then you can go into this obelisk and divert over here and then come back to Gunker later. Nothing too Sanguine intensive in this area. You want to make sure that you leave some clear spaces here. Especially in this boss fight, you want to make sure that you don't put Sanguine in a spot where, Nano is going to go and charge to and then sit in for a while. So that's something to try and watch out for when you're clearing trash in this area. But beyond that, there's not too much that goes wrong with that affix here. It's a fairly wide open dungeon. In Workshop, Sanguine does actually become a bit of a challenge in a few spots. Depending on how you handle this first pull, you may be killing them with the hammers, or you may be trying to kill them with the, where's that thing? The rocket barrages. Both of those are abilities that will deal damage to you and to the enemies here. So a very common strategy is to try and group them all up and then kill them to one of those two AoE effects. With Sanguine, if something dies a little bit early, that of course gets a huge wrench thrown in it, so be ready to adapt on the fly if stuff dies out of order here. And then beyond that, you've got a Sanguine challenge here, where you want to make sure that you don't, end up filling the whole corridor with a bunch of blood. These things die very quickly, so that can happen if you're not careful. You do get enough of a grace period here where you can probably start all 5 of these on their death animations before the first Sanguine puddle spawns. So that's a useful way to play around that there. Here, you're going to want to watch out for your Sanguine as well because, more enemies are going to be spawning, so try to kill stuff where the next set of enemies doesn't spawn if possible. And that's kind of all there is to it. You're home free after that. I'd recommend fighting the Blood of the Corruptor with the last boss if you're able to. So just don't activate this obelisk. It doesn't let you skip anywhere. You have to deal with those annoying Mindren tentacles. You don't have to fight them at all if you just fight the Blood of the Corruptor with the last boss. And it is a fortified week, so it's one of the better weeks to try and do that sort of thing. That's it for this week in Mythic Plus. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, remember to like and subscribe. Good luck in your keys out there, and also check out my Twitch stream, twitch.tv/ratnose. Thanks everybody for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.